Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this chat. So my name's Liana Di Giorgio, like Donna said. I'm a senior associate with Norton Rose Fulbright in Toronto in the Information Governance, Privacy, and Cybersecurity group. And I'm here with our two speakers, Kevin Downey, who is the CTO and co-founder of Data Sentinel, and Patricia Thaine, who's the CEO and co-founder of Private.ai. And I'll turn it over to each of them to tell us a bit more about themselves and what they do. So go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, thanks so much. As Liana said, my name is Kevin Downey. I've spent about half of my career in software companies and the other half of my career in services companies. So I have a lot of hands-on experience all around the data management space. From the software perspective, I started off life at Oracle, going to a company called Essential, which was a precursor for almost all of the IBM information management products, and now Data Sentinel. From a services perspective, I've probably helped over 100 different clients within the data governance and data management portfolios within their organization, as well as I've taught at various industry groups like the Data Warehouse Institute, as well as private teaching. So it's a little bit about me.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Patricia.
Thank you, Liana. And I'm the co-founder and CEO of Private.ai. As Liana mentioned, at Private.ai we make it really easy for developers to integrate privacy into their software pipelines. In particular, we make it easy for them to redact, de-identify, or create synthetic personal data within text. And we can also help identify personal information within docx, XLS, a number of other different file types in addition to just plain text. And I'm also a researcher in privacy preserving natural language and spoken language processing.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we launch into some more substantive questions, I'll just give a bit of an overview of where we're at with de-identified information in the law. So traditionally, privacy laws have regulated identifiable information, and then de-identified information or anonymized information is often kept separate. So de-identified information is information that does not identify or could not reasonably identify a specific individual. There are many risks associated with this, particularly when we think about re-identification and how easy that can be today with the amount of information out there and the technologies available. So that's something that we'll discuss a bit further. Anonymized data, on the other hand, is more so information where identifiers have been removed and it shouldn't be traceable back to a specific individual. And we'll also get into the different techniques that can be used to anonymize information. Ontario recently proposed new privacy legislation. We don't know if it'll happen or not, but if it does, it would potentially regulate de-identified information, prohibit re-identification of that information, basically recognizing what a risk this is, and incentivizing people to use anonymized data more often. So we'll see, how that transpires, but I think it's important to recognize, and we'll certainly discuss this, the line between the two, how it's being blurred, and how what we really need to think about is the techniques that can be used to remove these identifiers and the sensitivity of the underlying information and how we can really mitigate risks where it is highly sensitive. So on that note, I will turn it over to Kevin for our first question. Information or data governance is an increasingly popular term. And we're hearing a lot about how important it is to have clear information or data governance strategies to mitigate the risks associated with collecting and using this type of information. Mm-hmm. So could you please give us an overview of how data governance impacts de-identified data? And also perhaps discuss the types of challenges that organizations are facing when it comes to meeting their obligations with this data.
Perfect, absolutely. So let's start, I guess, with a little overview of what we would consider to be data governance, because it's a very broad-ranging topic and a lot of folks have different ideas. So I like to think of data governance as simply the people, processes, and policies that are put in place as part of an enterprise initiative, as part of an enterprise program to manage and safely store information. So in other words, your data assets within the organization. But not just the management or the storage of that information, but as well the alignment between what the objectives are, the priorities are of your organization to how the data is actually managed. So in other words, making the data purpose fit for what you're trying to achieve out of it, thus getting the most value out of it. So that's kind of data governance in a little bit of a nutshell. The first step of data governance that most people in the industry agree with is kind of figuring out what data that you have to govern to begin with. So we're talking now about data inventory. And in the near past of data governance, a lot of the inventory was a start and stop project, whereby you went through, hired a bunch of people, found out what data elements you have within your organization, wrote them down in a nice little binder, and it sat on a shelf, right? Because data changes so rapidly that that was hard to do. So we talk very much about active data inventory. So being able to have a data inventory that keeps current with the state of your data and with all the data holdings in the organization, because some people are very focused on structured, some people are very focused on unstructured or file data, data lakes, etc. But we want to create an inventory that has all of those data holdings within your organization so that you have the full picture of what that is. In addition to the inventory, as some people think it's kind of the place and what is the data, in addition to that, we want to dive into the actual data holdings themselves and understand what the content is of that holding, which I'm sure Patricia will talk a lot more about as we go through the next little bit. That classification of data is really important. Now, within the data governance framework, there's a thing called critical data elements. It's hard to say. Critical data elements, which is, again, kind of the start of the governance process where you align the information that's necessary to run and really excel at the business with the type of data that you need. So the data elements, right? In practice, when you put in this infrastructure for this active data inventory, it's incredibly important to align those critical data elements with the classification scheme and meld those together. But the cool thing is, if you do that, I get animated with governance, as funny as that is, if you do that, you suddenly understand where all of the critical data elements are, and ironically, most of the time, critical data elements within your organization are in fact that data that you're trying to protect, the data that you're trying to de-identify. So through a data governance program, and a lot of people out there have started these, and a lot of people have gone through, a lot of companies I should say, have gone through and created data inventories and active data inventories. And they may not even realize that they already know where most of their critical data elements are. Also, most importantly, they're not missing anything because it's an automated process. So you're ensured that you're going to get everything, you're going to see everything, and you're going to know where it is. Now, with the alignment of that and the critical data elements, you also get why you need those elements, why you need that process. And depending on the usage, that speaks a lot to the method that you're going to use to de-identify the data. Right? So whether, in some cases, a critical data element usage may be time-based. In other words, if it's too old, it's not useful to the organization. That can be dealt with in one form of de-identification. On the other hand, some other elements you may need only from a summary perspective. That can be dealt with in a different way. And lastly, some elements you may need to re-identify because it's part of a payment processing facility or an audit facility that regulations say that you need to keep. That can be dealt with. So I think it's important for everyone to realize as well that rarely in an organization can you simply have one data de-identification strategy. It's really there to be a purpose-built strategy per data element, and the data governance gives you that. So putting all that together, I think you can kind of see that the governance process can drive really where, how, and what methods you're going to use to de-identify data, giving you full protection from a privacy or compliancy perspective, understanding that your customer data is going to be kept secure because you know where it is and you know how to secure it. But at the same time, really important, I think, is keeping the value of the data for your organization. In other words, you're protecting it in a way that it's still useful for that enterprise, which I think is really key to data-driven enterprises today. So I think that's kind of how it all fits together in my view.
No, for sure. That's awesome. Thank you. And that leads very nicely into our next question, which is for Patricia, and deals more with the actual methods that organizations can use to de-identify or anonymize information. And I guess, Patricia, could you maybe discuss some of these techniques and explain how they may be suited to different types of data or sensitivity levels of data, like Kevin mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a great explanation. It really is about thinking through what kind of data that you have. So you might have structured data, you might have unstructured data, various kinds, images, video, text, audio. So you need to identify that, and then you will have to deal with it in vastly different ways according to what purpose you have for the data, who needs to have access to which aspects of the data, and what kind of data you're actually handling. So if you think of text, for example, we work with a lot of conversational AI companies and contact centers. So in one case, they'd want the information like phone number and person's name in order to contact them back. But then if you're sending that data to your data science team, you don't want them to have anything that's personally identifiable, and also no quasi-identifiers in there as well, very likely. So what you're dealing with is two different kinds of entities. The direct identifiers like names, full names, exact locations, credit card numbers, and then the quasi-identifiers, which when combined together, like religion, approximate location, any sort of disease that a person might have, they increase exponentially the likelihood of re-identifying an individual. And when you're dealing with unstructured data versus structured data, the cool part is that if you could strip out this information from unstructured data and still get a lot of value from it in several cases. So you could still tell how well a customer service conversation went. Does this agent need training? What products were mentioned? You could still grab a lot of metadata and make a lot of inference with that information. If you're thinking of images and you just remove all the people in an image, you could still tell how many cars were in the image, or you could tell how many people were there without actually being able to identify the blurry bodies. You could see what time of day it was. So we're dealing with a whole different paradigm than when you're dealing with structured data. When you're dealing with structured data, a lot of the times it is made up of a bunch of quasi and direct identifiers. So what you're trying to do is get enough information so you could generalize about populations rather than get specific information about individuals. So there are a couple of methods that you could use there. You could use a combination, L diversity, for example, combined with K anonymity, which does get its fair share of slack, but the problem is that if you use those without combining it with appropriate risk re-identification methods, then you can get into trouble. So it is tricky. You need a statistician to work with you on these methods. And then there's differential privacy that you can use to query these structured data sets, which the idea there is you're adding a bit of noise to the result of a query. So you could see how many people in this data set have smoke and have cancer and get an approximate result. But if you have, for example, a more specific query, like how many people in this data set smoke, have cancer, and then also have this rare disease, if you get a 1, you don't know if the answer was a 1, a 2, a 0. So it's very difficult when you're combining that information with other data to determine whether a particular individual was part of that data set.
Okay. Awesome, thank you.
Pleasure.
Okay, so now that we've learned a bit more about data governance, how de-identified information fits into that, and some of the specific techniques that can be used, have another question to get at really mitigating the risks of re-identification, while also bearing in mind that information may need to be re-identified in order to be useful or for organizations to comply with privacy legislation. So Kevin, what are some of the controls that you see organizations putting in place to reduce the likelihood that their de-identified information will be re-identified in an unauthorized way?
So I'm not going to talk too much, or I'm not going to talk at all about security because I think that's been well hashed out and it's not overly interesting. One of the things I find that's interesting though, and of course it's very important though, I don't want to undermine that, and security scheme is extremely important, but one thing that's a little bit more interesting, kind of talking about classifications as we were, is how people are using classification information now cross cross elements within their repository to see what is near. Kind of that, you may have heard the word triad, or the triad effect of identifying somebody. It's not good enough just to get rid of one of their pieces of information, because if there's another couple nearby, you can still possibly identify the person. So we're starting to see the classification schemes getting a lot smarter. A lot of them are becoming repository-based now into some sort of a repository where you can apply analytics. And you're starting to see schemes where we can look at proximity of elements from one to another, clusters, if you wish, of these elements coming together, and understanding what pieces of information belong to perhaps the same entity or the same person that come through, and making sure that if someone decides to, say, de-identify a credit card number, which is an obvious one that a lot of companies do, but they may forget about de-identifying a date of birth, because in and of itself, it's not highly identifiable, or a city, or an email even, although that's a little bit dicier. But if you start to put these things together, even though you may have blanked out the credit card, if nearby someone still has a date of birth and a city and maybe even a first name, you can still possibly identify that individual. So that kind of a triad analysis of looking at both structured and unstructured in proximity to each other, and making sure that we don't see a collection or a clustering of information about those individuals for a particular entity. And that whole thing you may hear of is called entity analytics, and that's becoming a very prominent secondary analysis to do on the data.
Thank you, Kevin. And Patricia, could you maybe discuss how organizations can sort of best balance the use of controls to prevent the unauthorized re-identification with some of their needs to re-identify?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you could think of having a filter to your data sets, for example, where depending on who's querying the data set, who's querying whether it be unstructured or structured data, they'd get different results for their purposes. Mm-hmm. And really minimizing the amount of data that you collect to the bare minimum of what you need in terms of personal information is number one. And then minimizing that spread as much as possible is number two. So making sure that if your data science team is asking you for certain data, you're not just giving them the keys to the castle, you're making sure that everything's clean. If they're training their machine learning models on it, you do have to be mindful that those machine learning models memorize information, and they might be spewing out personal data into production. So everybody in the organization should be mindful about these privacy challenges and always keep an eye out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something I'm very familiar with, is advising people to be very careful with how they're disclosing information and how much. And one question I get a lot is, what can I do with this information? How long can I hold on to it? And that's exactly my answer is, well, how long do you need to hold on to it? Because that's how long you have. So with that, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to ask about either of your answers. What are some of the more, problematic scenarios that you've seen that you could caution people against in terms of things that don't work for classifying data?
Well, a lot of times we see people kind of going down the rabbit hole that they don't really know where to start. And someone says, hey, you need to make sure that you don't have any identifiable information, and they just look at the entire information holdings, and for even a small corporation, it's a lot of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And they just don't know where to start. And they start with a program that tries to de-identify or mask or encrypt everything, and it's never going to work with our current technology footprint. Even with cloud data sources that Google has a set of digital loss protection algorithms, as well as Amazon, as well as Azure, but they are still very focused on individual pieces of data, right? And so I think the thing that we see a lot is people don't know where to start. They don't take the time to step back and understand what's important through, a any kind of framework, governance framework, or any kind of framework that is, and they just start some kind of a large initiative that has no value to the organization. So I think, you know, being laser focused in something like de-identification is really important to show quick wins, to show value, and to not overly burden the rest of the organization with something that really isn't important, yet making sure that all of your critical information that needs to be protected certainly is.
Sure. Thank you. And do you
Yeah,
have a comment? Or?
There are a couple of things I want to add to that. I'd also add that it's really important that much like security software, this isn't something that you necessarily want to do yourself. Mm-hmm. It's very complicated to get it right, mm-hmm. and we're already used to not building your own crypto. Don't build your own privacy algorithms. It's also very difficult to do. It takes years to build something that works well. And even companies that are, you know, experienced in data loss prevention, for example, even internal teams who might be running their own de-identification or personal data identification, mm-hmm. They'll often be using things like regular expressions, which don't generalize well to unstructured data. And 80% of the data produced in the world is unstructured. So that might work pretty well in your structured databases, but it will really fall short when it comes to your unstructured data. So be careful about trying to move techniques from one realm to another realm without thinking it through properly.
Okay. Okay. And I guess what kind of baby steps can entities take? I know that you're talking about sort of not trying to do it yourself, and I support that in my profession. It's often the advice I give people too. But what baby steps can people sort of take if they're trying to really wrap their heads around developing a data governance strategy that deals with de-identified data, and, you know, what kind of products or what kind of softwares or algorithms are available to them?
I think the first step is probably a little bit on the education side. As Patricia said, you know, there is, you know, you don't want to have to build this yourself. You don't want to build it yourself. And there's so much material to become at least aware or, you know, somewhat educated on the matter, and then get someone that's done it before. I mean, it's like everything else, right? You're not going to build a house yourself the first time through. Talk to someone that's done it before, and have them walk through the process with you. Too many companies, you know, we've seen a lot of companies where we walk into, and they figure, you know, how hard can it be? Or they have, you know, your favorite software sales rep from, you know, like say a big company that starts with I, you know, trying to back up the truck and sell you a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of products out there, but you really need to understand how you're going to use it effectively in your organization. So I think the baby step is to get a little bit get a little educated first.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay. Okay. I guess, what does Private AI do that can help educate people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
So we have blog posts, we host webinars. We hosted a webinar with Dr. Ann Kavukian, with Carol Piovesan, who's a privacy lawyer. We've hosted a webinar with the previous CPO of Twilio. And we keep trying to bring more experts in to discuss what their experiences are with regards to privacy by design, as well as integrating data governance internally in gigantic organizations. Mm-hmm. But the blog post that we put out there, the white paper that we have, really talks about what it means to de-identify data, what the various privacy technologies are. We have a privacy-enhancing technologies decision tree that you could look at to see what fits your particular problem. Always feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions. I'd be happy to answer what privacy-enhancing technology might be right for your use case.
Okay. And Kevin, I guess a similar question for Data Sentinel.
So Data Sentinel, we're a data privacy management platform. So we start at the gathering of information about your data holdings through to how you're governing or how you have policies managing your information, all the way through to remediation and everything in between. So we take the stance, because we came from a consulting background, that we want the software to really work for an individual organization. So we spend a lot of time and effort in partnering with our clients to ensure that we're doing the right thing for them and to help educate them along the way. So we have, like as an example, a data governance step-by-step little methodology that we'll go through with them. So we're happy to start that conversation and help them walk through the various processes and really tell them if they're even ready to begin the first step or if they need to do some homework first.
Okay, thank you. We have a bit of time left, so maybe we'll get into cautionary tales. If you guys can think of one example of what not to do, maybe that would be a fun question.
Yeah, one that often comes to mind because we deal with a lot of conversational data is the story of ScatterLab, which is a company that was creating a chatbot with a bunch of sensitive information from their users. So they were just collecting conversations between lovers and spewing that out into production with this chatbot. That was
it's not problematic at all.
No, not at all. No. Just nicknames, names, addresses, no big deal. So they got into quite a bit of trouble, and really it's about what this can happen when you're not careful about what your machine learning models are learning. So think about your training data. If they had thought about their training data, they could have used either differential privacy or de-identification, pseudonymization. There are methods out there to help you, and your techniques and your technologies don't have to suffer from the lack of clean data if you look at it properly.
For sure. So, make sure you're using the right technique to use the information you apparently really feel like you're entitled to use.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, how about you, Kevin?
It's little bit different story. So we were dealing with an entertainment company that had a lot of remote offices, let's say. And they were very concerned with client data going out into the public domain, and a lot of their workers were, I won't say transient, but they were very short-term temporary workers. So they came up with an encryption scheme that they thought would be perfect to have the data encrypted, and it all was really good, worked really well until the day that their encryption keys got corrupted. And all of their data was, for years of data, years of value, was locked behind keys that weren't kept properly, and they couldn't really access it anymore. They had to go back to backups that were way too old. They lost a tremendous amount of time, tremendous amount of money, and a tremendous amount of data. So I think the moral to the story is that you really have to be careful of how you implement these things, and you can't take any part of the process for granted. It has to be a well-oiled machine before you put something like that into production.
For sure.
That's so heartbreaking. I feel bad for them.
Yeah. I regularly deal with cybersecurity breaches, so I've seen that happen quite a few times, and I've seen strategies backfire, and I've seen other ones really protect people. So
yeah, exactly.
It's you have to turn your mind to it one way or another.
Technology used well works well, right?
For sure. Okay, well, with that, I think we're coming up near time. So, we've only really scratched the surface of this area. We've talked about it quite a bit, but as you can see, in practice, there are so many different ways that this could go, depending on what your business does and the classifications that you need and your resources in terms of being able to develop those techniques or use those techniques that are made available. Again, so as complexity in this area continues to grow with profiling, automated decision making, and so many other things that are becoming more commonplace, it'll be really important for organizations to continue implementing these safeguards and these processes to protect information, to mitigate risks of re-identification that's unauthorized, and to really protect sensitive data if that's what you're dealing with. And with that, I'd like to just thank the organizers and Kevin and Patricia for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.